Hi, welcome to Mikey's Video Game Madness. Today we're playing Final Fantasy 3, also known as 6 later on the Super Nintendo. Now, I'll try to explain this as simple as I possibly can. Final Fantasy 1 was released on the original Nintendo in the West, as well as the Famicom, which is the Nintendo equivalent in Japan. So, there's actually two other games released in Japan, but not in the West, which was Final Fantasy 2 and Final Fantasy 3. Alright, so when the Super Nintendo and the Super Famicom came out in Japan, they released Final Fantasy 4. Since Final Fantasy 1 was only released in the West, they called Final Fantasy 4 Final Fantasy 2. Then they released 5 in Japan. That one didn't come out here at that time. So then they eventually released 6. Alright? So when they released 6 here in the West, it was the third Final Fantasy game to come out. So they just named it Final Fantasy 3. Now, it threw off a lot of people because then Squaresoft wanted to start numbering their Final Fantasy games as they do in Japan. So when the PlayStation came out, they came out with Final Fantasy 7, which didn't make a lot of sense to people because we had Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, and then 7. What was the deal with that? That was because the actual Final Fantasy 2, 3, and 5 were not released here. Eventually we got those on the PlayStation. So this is actually Final Fantasy 6. I chose the Super Nintendo version because this was the first one to come out here, and this one isn't a port. This is actually the original code for the game. Now this one isn't as translated as well. If you want a decent translated version, I suggest you either get the one that's released on Windows or the one on the Game Boy Advance. There was a PlayStation anthology of Final Fantasy which contained, again, we got the short end of the stick, Final Fantasy 5 and Final Fantasy 6, which was this game, and it had added cutscenes and whatnot to it. You actually can download that on the PlayStation Store, and I believe you actually can play this game on your cell phone. I'm not a fan of cell phones, but if you were to personally ask me, I would get the Game Boy Advance version if you have the Game Boy Advance. Otherwise, if you're a PC gamer, I get the PC version. There's nothing wrong, and I have actually spent the most time with the PlayStation Final Fantasy Anthology version of 6. There's nothing wrong with it. It does have loading times, and I think the colors and effects look a little desaturated, but that's a subjective thing. You know, I haven't played this game on any system in a long time, so I really can't necessarily compare, but when I remember playing it, I felt like the colors and stuff weren't as vibrant or as sharp as the Super Nintendo version. That could have been completely in my head, but I did really appreciate the nice Squaresoft cutscenes, which Square is really good at making cutscenes even today. I mean, they're stylized because of the, I don't want to call it anime artwork. I feel like Final Fantasy has its very own distinct style of artwork, but it's headed in the anime direction versus the more realistic direction. I love the music in this cutscene, by the way. This is probably, in my opinion, the most cinematic of all the 2D Final Fantasies. So anyway, we got the short end of the stick with Final Fantasy Anthology, because in Japan they got Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 in a soundtrack. We got Final Fantasy 5 and 6 in a soundtrack, and I wish I would have got the strategy guide at the time. It was so thick, it was like the size of like the Bible. But later on we got the other game with Chrono Trigger and the Final Fantasy Chronicles compilation, which came with Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy 4. Out of all the 2D Final Fantasies, I feel like this is the most accessible. This is when Square was starting to try to appeal to more of a mainstream audience. This game is by no means a cakewalk, but it's easier than, say, if you played Final Fantasy 2 or 4 or whatever. 5, they just seem to get progressively easier, though with 12 and 13, I think maybe it's just because they're different. I felt like they were harder, but like with 7 and 8, if you know how to play it right, although the final bosses are pretty brutal. And then 9 and 10, I feel like they were even more accessible than this game. I have Final Fantasy X2 on the Final Fantasy, I guess it was called the Final Fantasy X Remaster. I actually have 2 versions of it because I saw that they had the PlayStation 4 one on sale, and I don't know, I'm a sap when it comes to Final Fantasy. It actually, believe it or not, does look significantly sharper, and I don't know why. It looks a little bit more colorful than the PlayStation 3 version, even though the PlayStation 3 version runs at similar resolutions. I don't know, it could be in my head again, but I feel like it looked significantly better. Wasn't probably the right way to describe it. It was noticeable, and the character models were a little bit better. Like, you could actually take the PlayStation 3 version of Final Fantasy X and boost up the resolution if you set the resolution manually to 1080p, but it still doesn't look as good as the PlayStation 4 version, which I think it had anti-aliasing if I remember correctly. And when you set it to 1080p on the PlayStation 3, I think the frame rate isn't as good. But it's been a while. I've only played the PlayStation 4 in a while, but I remember when I first got the PlayStation 4, like that was noticeable, at least to me. And what's cool is if you want to upgrade to the PlayStation 4 version, there's like this cloud that Square has at the moment where it'll transfer all your saves. There's also a Vita version as well, and whatever version you're playing, you can transfer your saves from that version to whatever new version you got. For instance, I played my game on PlayStation 3, and then when I got the PlayStation 4 version, I just uploaded my PlayStation 3 saves to the cloud, and it went to the PlayStation 4. I have yet to play X2, which seems like a really weird take on a Final Fantasy series. It's like a sequel, and you didn't see that again until Final Fantasy 13-2 and then Lightning Returns, which is really 13-3, but they don't want to call it 13-3 because the battle system's so drastically different, and it's almost action oriented and has that time deal going on. But this game is actually somewhat cut. At least this game footage is somewhat cut because this was a 40-minute video. I'm lucky to get it as short as I can, so whenever you see the blocks, that means I got in the battle, but I tried to leave significant battles in to let you know what the battle system looks like, but I cut out most of the battles because it's repetitive and it doesn't make for a good video. RPGs are really hard to record, so I highly recommend trying this game out. And like I said, it's on Windows if you don't console game or you don't have a handheld, but I personally like these games on handheld because these older RPGs, there's some newer ones too, but it isn't as common. Usually in newer RPGs, as long as you do the side missions and stuff like that, you're usually typically leveled up enough to not have to grind. These games typically require grinding. See, that's a moment where I cut out the battle, but I made sure that you knew it was a battle when it got all pixelated. It saves time for you and I, because I don't know if I could talk about this game for 40 minutes, especially without trying to spoil anything. So essentially, you're like this girl that has magic abilities. If you saw earlier, I was the only one that could use cure because I had magic. So you're unique in some way, and this kind of, even though the Final Fantasy games, unless they're direct sequels like X2 or 13-2 or Lightning Returns, unless it's like a direct sequel, all the Final Fantasies are standalone, but they all kind of share similar themes. And this one was really headed towards the direction Final Fantasy VII was going. Final Fantasy VII is more about technology and how technology is ruining the world and stuff like that. And this is kind of during an era where technology took over and people are forgetting about magic existing and stuff like that. And now here's this girl that's able to use magic, and you go on this grand adventure and stuff like that. Also, one thing I noticed, this is one of the first Final Fantasies that I can remember where you actually have to use strategy based on what the enemies are doing instead of just hitting basically a static picture all the time. I screwed up on it, but basically with this, and if you read the text, you know what to do. You have to shoot the snail's body, or the whelk. I believe that's how you would say it. If I'm saying it wrong, I guess you can feel free to correct me. I know a lot of people on YouTube like to correct people. But I was clicking attack too fast, so now I can't cancel out my attacks, and I'm attacking the shell. The shell absorbs power and it hits me back. Right now I should be waiting, because this is using the active time battle system, which you can see on the right side. When the bars fill up, then the enemies can attack. I mean, your party can attack, and the enemy has kind of like an invisible bar. So if I would have just waited and just worked on healing my party, I wouldn't have had my one guy die. And as you can see, there's Wedge there. Every Final Fantasy has a wedge in Biggs, which is a Star Wars reference. I don't know if any of you guys picked up on that. Maybe you're Final Fantasy fans and not Star Wars fans. I don't know. It kind of throws you off a little bit because the way it disappears, it looks like you killed the enemy, because it kind of fades out like it does when you, again, kill the enemy. But it was actually just hiding in its shell, which can throw you off a bit. Like I said, I haven't played this game in a long time, and I knew I was recording a video, so I was kind of rushing and not paying as much attention as maybe I should, because I was trying to keep this video under an hour. But this is a really nice looking game. I can't really recommend the Super Nintendo version just because it's so darn ridiculously expensive. I mean, it's not uncommon to find it close to $100 out of the box. Now, if it comes with a box and manual, expect to pay more. This is like almost as valuable as Chrono Trigger. It's not quite on the Earthbound level, where if you get it in the box with the strategy guide, it's like $1,000. It's not like that, but it's quite pricey. And if you can find Final Fantasy Anthology on the PlayStation 1, you really can't go wrong. I mean, and it also comes with Final Fantasy V, which is kind of a cool game. It has like this pirate theme going on, which I kind of like. And it kind of looks archaic compared to this game. This is like the last Final Fantasy 16-bit game before 7 came out, so it doesn't look as good. I mean, the games before it don't look as good. Like, you can see your menu screen, it's all faded like into a darker blue. On all the other Final Fantasy games on the Super Nintendo or the PlayStation, because we only got 4 and 6 are Final Fantasy 2 and 3 on the Super Nintendo, which is what they're called on the Super Nintendo. But if you got the PlayStation version or versions on the computer, I think 4, they redid 4 with polygons on the Nintendo DS, so that's a completely different experience. But there's good versions of 4 and this game on the like 2D versions, like retranslated versions of the Super Nintendo version on the Game Boy Advance, which if you can find those, I highly recommend those if you don't want to play it on the PC. But if you're a PC gamer, it's the way to go, seriously. And you're probably going to get the cutscenes. You're not going to get the cutscenes on GBA, but I haven't personally played the Windows version, but it's cool that it's on Windows. And there's probably a cell phone version too, and now the cell phone version might have the cutscenes, I don't know. because nowadays they're able to compress so much stuff into like a small file size. It's not even funny, and the phones have so much memory on them compared to like a Super Nintendo game or even a PlayStation 1 disc. They can do a lot. So yeah, and if you get Final Fantasy Anthology, like Final Fantasy, I think they make you pay for them separately on the PlayStation Network. If you have a PlayStation Vita or a PSP, you can download it on there. Like I said, these games require a lot of grinding, so to me it's more fun to play grindy games on the go, because you can just put a little bit time here and put a little bit of time there instead of sitting in front of a TV screen and doing the same things over and over again. The battle system's a little bit simple, so there's not a lot of strategy, in my opinion, to keep it interesting. That's not a complaint, that's just the way RPGs were at the time. But this one is probably the least grindy Final Fantasy, or 16-bit Final Fantasy. But like I said, I don't really want to spoil anything, so you're only going to see the beginning of the game. And as you can see, everything's like kind of like steampunk, where everything's just running on Steam. There's no reliance on magic. If you go back and play the other Final Fantasies, it's more of a medieval fantasy setting with, of course, Final Fantasy quirks like airships and stuff like that. But yeah, it was a change, and I wouldn't be surprised if this runs on the same engine Chrono Trigger does, because it really does. Beside the art style, it really does look like Chrono Trigger in a lot of ways. This is one of those games that would actually graphically blow the Sega Genesis out of the water. Like, Sega Genesis had the amazing Phantasy Star 4, which was originally supposed to come out on the Sega CD, which was why it has a lot of cutscenes, and that game was super expensive even when it came out. I think it was between $80 or $100 because there was so much space on it. I don't know why they didn't release it for the Sega CD, because a lot of people couldn't afford a $100 cartridge either. So I don't know if it got the reception it truly deserved, because I know they were probably scared that nobody was going to play it if it came out on the Sega CD. But the Lunar games got pretty popular. I wish people would have gave it more of a chance when it came out on the PlayStation 1. There's also a PSP version of at least the first game that came out, but nobody was into it by then, so I don't think we'll ever see another Lunar game. I believe Game Arts made that, who also made the Grandia series, another series that I would like to see come back from the dead, although some people that worked on it, I believe the composer of that game actually passed away. But then again, Grandia 3 doesn't, at least to me, doesn't feel like Grandia 2 or 1, but it has like one of my favorite battle systems ever. It has kind of like the active time battle system, but you have to use more strategy, because here you see you don't, even though this is like a flashback, you don't really see when the enemies are going to attack, whereas Grandia shows you every point in time the enemies are going to attack, and you actually can use counter attacks that'll actually block your enemy's attack, and it's way more strategic, and I really like that. And the music's fantastic, and I really like the artwork, and the artwork in here is really fantastic as well. Like, you don't see all this machinery and stuff like that. Like I said, this was a precursor to Final Fantasy VII, which for a few games until Final Fantasy IX, the Final Fantasies used the futuristic setting, and then they didn't really go back into it until like Final Fantasy X, and they went back to the medieval thing for Final Fantasy 11 and 12, and then for 13 they went back to the futuristic setting. And the 14 they went back to the past again. When I say the past, I just mean the fantasy setting. And then looks like 15's back to a futuristic setting. So I'm not sure they know which type of theme they like the best. But like for 16-bit games, if you want a story beside reading something out of an instruction manual, RPGs were the way to go. And beside this game, I would highly recommend for people who are new to RPGs that want to experience the 16-bit era, I would highly recommend this game, Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger would probably be number one. I think that's the most accessible. Earthbound would probably be the second most accessible, and this is like the third most accessible. But if you want to go back and experience like 16-bit RPGs and want to see what the story was like and the graphic styles, and plus Earthbound's kind of archaic, but this game and Chrono Trigger still hold up fairly well. Even though it's 2D artwork, it looks really good. And if you're into some of these newer games that have like a 16-bit art style, actually this game looks better than some of the stylized 16-bit art style games. So you really can't go wrong, and these games have come out almost on every system ever in some form since the PlayStation 1 days, except like don't count in then like Nintendo 64 or whatever, because basically these games like Final Fantasy 7 would have actually came out on the Nintendo 64, but they had the brilliant idea to continue to use cartridges, which frustrated Squaresoft because they wanted to continue in the theme of making these huge story-oriented games, and they wanted to start adding cutscenes and stuff like that. So they were really excited about the new technology in the Nintendo 64, but the cartridges just couldn't barely hold anything. So they would have had to, especially at that time, either made this super expensive cartridge that nobody could afford, kind of like what Sega did with Phantasy Star 4. And Phantasy Star 4 is pretty accessible as well, compared to at least Phantasy Star 2 and 1, which brutally hard, and half of it requires luck and half of it requires a shit ton of grinding, because when you start out to grind in the Phantasy Star games, like, you'll get killed just in your first battle and have to start the game all over again. So when you first start out, a lot of it's based on just straight up chance. So this one is based more on how much you level up, what strategies you use. Like in a Final Fantasy game, if there's something organic, you want to use fire, or something made out of fire, you want to use ice, something that's like robotic. And this rule kind of applies to most of the Squaresoft games. If there's something robotic, you want to use like lightning attacks, etc., etc. And ironically enough, for ghosts, healing spells actually kill them. That's the only thing that hurts ghosts in Final Fantasy games, which is kind of cool, but it really sucks if you have neither. But this game requires more strategy and leveling up than straight up luck, which a lot of RPGs rely on when you first start, which isn't really fair. And when it's story oriented, you really want to experience, at least for me, I want to experience the story more than I do the actual battle systems. Sometimes the battle systems are really fun. Like I said, I really like Grandia's battle system. Chrono Trigger's battle system is pretty fun too. It's similar to this, but there are some slight quirks. And Chrono Cross, which is like the spiritual sequel to Chrono Trigger, that's a PlayStation 1 game if you're curious, that actually uses this weird color system, which you actually have to use attacks that are related to whatever color status the enemy's on. It's kind of weird to explain. Maybe I'll cover it one day. But again, RPGs are super hard to make videos of because they're so spaced out as far as stories go. Like, this is a 100-hour game depending on how much time you put into it, because you have to grind and level up. Like that overworld you saw right there, that's like typically where you would want to level up. You'll see areas with trees and stuff like that. That usually has the most enemies and stuff like that, and you'll just run back and forth until you run into an enemy, level up, go to a town, restore your health, and rinse and repeat. That's why I feel like a portable version of these games are really great. That being said, I really enjoy the Persona series, and I can't wait till Persona 5 comes out on console. But I will say that when Persona 4 came out on PS Vita, it was way more accessible than playing on the PlayStation 2, scooted up to a TV, fighting the same enemies over and over again. But I don't hold it against the game. It's just one of those games that can be somewhat hard to get into if you're not in like a patient mood and you want to play something quick, and you just want to experience the story. Sometimes it can be annoying depending on what kind of mood you're in, but I love the RPG genre. I love Western RPGs and I love Japanese RPGs as well, and it's just one of those things that I always say you're earning the story in a way. But like I said, this one isn't as grind heavy. Like, for instance, for Final Fantasy VII, I was used to playing older Final Fantasy games, so I spent hours grinding more than I should have. So when I went to go fight the enemies later on in the game, I was like over leveled, so everything was like super easy because I was used to older RPGs, and it was just ridiculous because I was just killing everything. There was no challenge at all. Like, I would hit something a couple of times and it would just die because my goal was just to level up to level 100 until I couldn't level up anymore, and it takes away the challenge. I mean, there were some enemies that required like some strategy, but not too much. And this game isn't as easy as Final Fantasy VII, but it's a good compromise. And like I said, I would definitely recommend this game if you want to experience older RPGs. I don't want to talk much about the story. Games pretty much speak for themselves. I hope I kept this video interesting because it's hard for me not to talk about this story. Like, you see the gameplay aspects and the game speaks for itself. This was one of the reasons why I got a Super Nintendo. Well, one of the reasons I got a Super Nintendo is we didn't have a whole lot of money and I couldn't get like a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64 that was out at the time. But I'm really grateful and glad that I did get a Super Nintendo late in its life cycle, because then I got to go back and experience all these amazing stories and RPGs that I wasn't able to before, and it was fantastic. And this is one of the first games that I rented because I always looked at the box. I think Chrono Trigger was the first one I rented, and then after Chrono Trigger I was like absolutely in love with RPGs. Even though I played Final Fantasy Star 4, I love that too, but after that, like, I didn't go back. I got a PlayStation 1 and I finally got to play Final Fantasy 7. The rest is history. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you're all doing well. Take care. Bye.
If you want to, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.